to a press conference that is being delivered by the U.S. Secretary of State, Antony Blinken. He's testifying before the Senate Foreign Affairs Committee on America's troop withdrawal from Afghanistan.
I have long maintained, however, that how the United States left mattered. Doing the right thing in the wrong way can end up being the wrong thing. And to get this right, the Biden administration needed to answer two fundamental questions. First, would the withdrawal leave a durable political arrangement in its wake? Second, would the U.S. and our allies maintain an ability to collect intelligence, conduct counterterrorism operations in a region still rife with groups, including ISIS-K, seeking to do us harm? I believe the U.S. clearly fell short on the first measure, and time will tell on the second, but the prospects don't look promising. So let me start with some framing questions about the Biden administration's Afghanistan decision-making. First, upon coming into office, how did the Biden administration assess the impact on the ground of President Trump's flawed deal with the Taliban? Did the administration attempt to negotiate better terms with the Taliban upon coming into office? Second, did the president's April withdrawal announcement set in motion any explicit contingency planning in the event that the Taliban rapidly took over the country? What was the plan to evacuate all Americans? What was the plan to evacuate SIVs, P1s, P2s, and other at-risk groups? What was the plan to evacuate staff and those affiliated with Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, Voice of America, the National Endowment for Democracy, and other U.S.-funded organizations? President Trump, with Stephen Miller, intentionally blocked SIVs from being processed, which I think is a barbaric and cruel decision which likely resulted in death for some U.S. partners. How did the Biden administration specifically accelerate processing SIVs upon coming into office? And third, what was the plan to avoid or deal with a refugee and humanitarian crisis? I expect you'll address some of these issues in your opening remarks. Let me applaud the efforts of the personnel on the ground from the Departments of State and Defense who worked under horrific circumstances. Their actions in evacuating over 120,000 individuals were nothing short of heroic, and these personnel deserve answers. The American public deserves answers, and the Afghan people certainly deserve answers. So let me close with 3 points. First, while communication from the administration has been frequent throughout this crisis, information from State, the Pentagon, and the White House has often been vague or contradictory. This was obviously a fluid and difficult situation. Frustration among many members was high, and this has to improve. And to put this in context, member frustration came on top of years of stonewalling by the Trump administration and its refusal to engage the Senate on the Taliban negotiations. This is one of the examples why I have been trying to pursue on the CASE Act to understand what are the written agreements that come between an administration and others. Maybe if we had seen all of the elements of it, we would have been poised in a better position. Second, I'm very disappointed that Secretary Austin declined our request to testify today. A full accounting of the U.S. response to this crisis is not complete without the Pentagon, especially when it comes to understanding the complete collapse of the U.S.-trained and funded Afghan military. His decision not to appear before the committee will affect my personal judgment on Department of Defense nominees. I expect the Secretary will avail himself to the committee in the near future, and if he does not, I may consider the use of committee subpoena power to compel him and others over the course of these last 20 years to testify. Third, I implore the administration to remain focused on Afghanistan. It's critically important that the world bear witness and take action when possible in response to Taliban abuses. Your visit, Mr. Secretary, to Qatar and Germany sent the right message, and I strongly urge sustained attention to Afghanistan in the months and years to come. I also urge the administration to strengthen its resolve and efforts to secure the relocation of our civil society partners now at grave risk, who were left behind in Afghanistan. They include heroic individuals working for organizations on the front lines of U.S. efforts to strengthen democracy and human rights, including the rights of Afghan women and girls. Finally, I know that Senator Young is not with us today. He is home in Indiana, attending the funeral of Marine Corporal Humberto Sanchez. Corporal Sanchez was among those killed in the horrendous terror attack on August 26th at the Kabul airport. I'd like to suggest that we have a moment of silence and pay our respects to all those brave American service members who were killed or injured on that day, and that we also honor the thousands of American service members, Afghan soldiers, and civilians who were casualties of this 20-year war. Please join me in a moment of silence. Thank you. With that, let me turn to the distinguished ranking member, Senator Risch, for his opening comments.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Blinken, good morning and welcome back to our committee. You're doing the right thing testifying here today, and I thank you. However, like the chairman, I am disappointed that some of your colleagues have declined to testify, particularly Secretary Austin. There's questions that we really need to have answered, and it's disheartening that they declined to testify. The debacle in Afghanistan is an interagency failure, and the fact that you're the only one stepping up is disheartening. I agree with the chairman that the withdrawal was a dismal failure. One of the things we need to get to the bottom to is who's responsible for this, who made the decisions. There's real questions right now as to who's making the decisions. We know for a fact that the President of the United States is somewhat disadvantaged here in that someone's calling the shots. He can't even speak without someone in the White House censoring it or signing off on it. As recently as yesterday, in mid-sentence, he was cut off by someone in the White House who makes the decision that the President of the United States is not speaking correctly. So I'd like to know who this person is. This is a puppeteer act, if you would, and we need to know who's in charge and who's making these decisions. And the only way we're going to get that is when we have people like you come in and answer questions. And when we get to question, I'm going to have more questions for you in that regard. Well, I supported a responsible end to the war in Afghanistan. No American thinks we should have left this way. America cannot end war simply by walking away. It is naive to assume our enemies will lay down their arms, leave us alone, and suddenly enshrine human rights if we go home. Indeed, there is a fierce battle of ideas and ambitions on the world stage, and the U.S. cannot remain neutral. However, President Biden presented the American people with a false choice in Afghanistan, and the rushed and embarrassing retreat is a stain on America's credibility that will have implications for years to come. There were other options that could have protected our national security interest, allowed for a more measured reduction in force, and preserved American credibility. I feel this administration is trying to blame the prior administration, and contrary to some that have said that the prior administration started this and is responsible, that's simply not true. The prior administration, when they took steps towards withdrawing from Afghanistan, entered into an agreement that had very, very specific conditions. I was privy to those, so I have personal knowledge of this. In February 2020, agreement was contingent upon the Taliban reducing violence, meeting counterterrorism commitments, and engaging in substantive talks with the Afghan government. These were all very important, and most importantly, it was telegraphed to the Taliban that failure to meet their commitments would be met with grave circumstances for them. The Taliban failed to meet any of these commitments, and yet this administration turned the country over to them. President Biden chose to withdraw from Afghanistan without conditions and without prudent planning, and obviously without, most important, telegraphing to the Taliban that they would enforce the conditions that the Taliban had agreed to. It didn't happen. It was a strategic, unforced error, and he did this against the advice of the commanders on the ground. One of the most embarrassing things I thought was the strike that was made, and obviously we can't talk about what we know from an intelligence standpoint, but the kinetic strike that was made after the Taliban entered the country, this de minimis strike, had dire consequences for civilians, but not for the Taliban. These are facts, and the president's withdrawal led to a Taliban offensive that toppled a democratically elected government, slammed the door on any chance for a final peace agreement, reversed the hard-earned rights of Afghan women and minorities, and will result in a safe haven for terrorists, many of whom wish to attack the United States. The Biden administration left Afghanistan in total disarray and single-handedly created a humanitarian crisis with thousands of refugees and internally displaced Afghans in need of immediate emergency assistance. Secretary Blinken, you characterized the evacuation as an extraordinary effort. You've touted over 124,000 evacuees. However, we abandoned the people we prioritized for departure. The department's efforts were plagued by a lack of basic planning, a failure to identify Americans, a failure to energize the SIV process months in advance, ignoring repeated congressional offers to help, and a failure to recognize the Taliban for what it is, a terrorist organization. The numbers are telling. You evacuated 6,040 Americans and say only a couple of hundred remain. Your own department told this committee in July that there were 10,000 to 15,000 Americans in Afghanistan. There's a huge difference between 6,000 and 15,000. What happened to these other Americans? The situation with the special immigrant visa evacuations is even more disturbing. Not counting the SIVs that arrived before Kabul's fall, you evacuated 705 of roughly 20,000 principal SIV applicants. What happened to these people? This committee reached out to the department in April, May, and June to help expedite SIV processing. We asked what additional authorities or resources you needed. For months, we received contradictory responses or no responses at all. I'll take a minute here to defend the State Department. One of the biggest problems to helping process SIVs was the enormous failure of the Department of Defense to provide the records needed to validate the Afghans who bravely helped our forces. The fact that the DoD didn't keep accurate records is irresponsible and a slap in the face to those who fought alongside of us. Obviously, we want to talk to Secretary Austin about this. Despite the enormous efforts of our troops and diplomats on the ground, the preventable tragedy that unfolded at the airport in Kabul was a disaster of leadership and of the administration's own making. Not only were you unable to ensure that Americans had access to the airport, many were turned away repeatedly after braving Taliban checkpoints, but Americans outside of Kabul had absolutely no chance of evacuation. Green card holders and SIVs should have been prioritized for access to the airport as well, but there was no mechanism to get inside. It was an informal network of Americans that helped get Americans and Afghans around the bureaucratic wall the administration set up at the airport. It should not have come to that. The administration is paying itself on the back for this evacuation is like an arsonist taking credit for saving people from the burning building he just set on fire. We know the U.S. military and our diplomats can do so much more than they did, if only their political bosses had gotten out of the way. Now we have an untold number of Americans, U.S. contractors, and SIVs still in Afghanistan. Despite repeated assurances, you will get them out. You've been unable to do so. Planes are stranded in northern Afghanistan. Our Voice of America employees and female Afghan students on scholarships have been abandoned, and our SIV applicants are in hiding as Taliban death squads hunt them down.
WION now available in your country. Download the app now. Get all the news on the move.